This episode is brought to you by Black Butler, Parody of the Phantomhives, a Black Butler abridged series / parody. Thank you. Greetings, mortals. Welcome to another session of the Infernal Court in musical hell. I'm Diva, your judge, jury, executioner, and...
What was that?
Taken at face value, you wouldn't expect our next offender, David Copperfield, to be so baffling. I mean, sure, it's a retelling of Charles Dickens' semi-autobiographical novel with anthropomorphic animals, but there have been literary retellings using animals before, there have been kid-friendly adaptations of classic literature, there's even been a kid-friendly adaptation of Charles Dickens using animals. And yet, none of that can prepare you for what you are about to witness. So let's just dive right in and examine the case of David Copperfield, shall we? It's a picturesque Christmas day in the quaint British town of Blunderstone, where we find the imperious Betsy Trotwood bustling off on a visit to her niece Clara Copperfield. The recently widowed Clara is in the process of giving birth, and Aunt Betsy is convinced the result will be a beautiful niece-to-be Betsy's godchild and namesake. This doesn't quite go as she plans.
Did you say he?
I did.
She did.
Say hello to your Aunt Betsy, David.
David.
See, Betsy is generally resentful of the male sex, and she doesn't even have a tattered wedding dress or moldy cake to show for it. But she does get to express her disdain for the opposite gender in the movie's first song.
Doctor, doctor, I want my niece! Bring her now, or you'll get no peace! Doctor, doctor, I want her now! I don't want a nephew! Don't mention him again! Don't you know that boys will grow up to be men?
Whose idea was it to score a mid-19th century story with a bad show choir backing track? Talented lady though she is, Andrea Martin can't make much of this and just ends up shouting most of the song. The Christmas carolers jumping in on backup are worth a laugh, though.
I hate boys!
She hates boys.
After Aunt Betsy Karens her way out of there, Clara and her maid Peggotty, who is a bear, I think, or possibly a mole, promise to keep baby David happy and free from care, which you know won't pan out well even in bowdlerized Dickens. Indeed, sinister forces are already afoot, as local cheese tycoon Mr. Murdstone has paused in his usual routine of kidnapping homeless kids to labor in his factories to explain to his flunky Grimby his plans to marry the widow Copperfield and get his hands on her money. He takes his own sweet time getting about to that, though, as it doesn't become an issue until baby Davy grows to a handsome young cat lad of 15 or so.
Can't I come? Please? I've never been to a birthday party.
No! You get the workers, and I get the money.
Davy has his misgivings about Mr. Murdstone, but Clara reminds him they need a strong man around because it's the 19th century and things frankly suck for women. But Davy assures Clara he can protect her himself.
In song form.
Said song, I'll Be Your Hero, is sin number 2, and it is one of the weirder fantasy sequences in this movie. Yes, there are multiple contenders for that category. Davy's sole character trait is that he's really into reading, and this is one of the few places it actually comes into play, as he imagines Clara as a princess kidnapped by a dragon with Murdstone's face, and he duplicates himself so he can transform into Robin Hood, Lancelot, and Ivanhoe to rescue her. All to the tune of the cheesiest early 90s pop arrangements you can imagine.
George, I'll be your hero. I'll be your Robin Hood. I'll be your Lancelot, the way I said I would.
Head-tilting insanity of the Imagine spot and electric guitar aside, did I mention Davy's supposedly playing this song on a harpsichord? Did nobody point out that he's singing this song of romantic damsel in distress rescue to his mother? Clara is touched by Davy's rather Oedipal declaration of chivalry, but she can't promise him that she won't marry Mr. Murdstone, and indeed she's walking out of the chapel with him in the very next shot. Murdstone immediately takes Clara off to update her will, and since she's already got the telltale tragic Victorian illness cough, I can see why he doesn't want to dawdle on that. Davy is disheartened, but he consoles himself by screwing around with Peggotty while she's trying to get work done. Murdstone doesn't approve of things like imagination and happiness, so he declares it's time for Davy to start learning a trade and arranges for him to be sent to the cheese factory. Clara's mild objections, along with Davy's insistence his mother should see a doctor for her tragic cough, are overruled with an "I'm in charge here and I know what's best for everyone," which, to be fair, is perfectly on brand for evil 19th century patriarchs. So Davy and his pet? Friend? I don't know, there's a bird hanging around that won't be relevant until about the last 20 minutes, are bundled off to London while Murdstone and Grimby dial the obvious evil up to 11.
Grimby, the boy wants to know what kind of physician he'll have.
Kind? You mean unkind?
At the gates of the factory, Murdstone's attempts to wail on Davy are interrupted by Agnes, daughter of the Duke, who is Murdstone and Grimby's landlord, and who is your standard-issue, genial but pompous British gent. Davy is dumbstruck by Agnes, emphasis on the dumb, and she's thrilled to have someone to nerd out over books with, so she convinces her dad to invite Murdstone and son over for tea. But no sooner is she out of sight than Murdstone throws Davy to the indignities of the workhouse, and the even greater indignities of his villain song.
We fixed the place up special. We've even polished up your chains. Look at all our smiling guests.
Not one of them complains.
I'm not sure where the line between delightfully over the top and just plain embarrassing is, but this song is over it by a considerable margin. Murdstone's part, I hesitate to call it a melody because he mostly talk-sings it, is ungainly and doesn't fit with the underscore, which is mostly stuck on synth organ from the end of Thriller mode. Davy is sent to live with some of the other workhouse drones at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber. It's not so bad. Sure, the Micawbers are constantly dodging their creditors, but they're nice enough folk in the Dickens kind-hearted but down-on-their-luck mold, and they have enough sense to make a show of abusing their charges in Murdstone's presence to keep him from subjecting the kids to even worse torture. So while Davy learns the ropes with his new buddy Mealy, Murdstone and Grimby engage in some good old-fashioned villain motivation ranting.
There's no reason why we can't control the world's cheese market.
There isn't?
No one can make cheese cheaper than Murdstone and Grimby.
No one's thought of using free labor.
That's your motivation? I mean, sure, kidnapping orphans for evil capitalism purposes is pretty awful, but still. Cheese? Actually, Murdstone's plotting is a bit all over the place in this. He wants Clara to die already so he can get her money, and he's been keeping her from receiving Davy's letters to help that along, but apparently her will hasn't been changed yet because she wants Davy to see it first, because I guess a teenager is suitable legal counsel now, but also Grimby can apparently forge her signature, so why is that even an issue? Whatever, his main goal for this part of the movie will be to psychologically break his stepson through hard labor, since escape from the factory is pretty much impossible, as Mealy is explaining.
Maybe you can do all those things, Davy.
I can.
But you can't escape from the cheese monster.
The cheese monster?
Oh, there's more. In addition to the cheese monster, which is really disappointing for something called the cheese monster, it's basically just a big vulture, the sewers below the factory are infested with moldies. Yes, moldies.
One of Murdstone's cheesy experiments went wrong.
Murdstone.
Yes, he invented a kind of cheeseless cheese.
Oh, he invented Velveeta. Anyway, there was an explosion and a bunch of child laborers got turned into mold monsters, and if they touch you, you become a mold monster too. Sweet Lucifer, you cut out Uriah Heep, one of the most magnificently repulsive antagonists to emerge from Charles Dickens' fertile imagination, and this is what we get in return? An oversized buzzard and cheese zombies? Davy decides if he can't escape, he might as well make the most of his situation, and uses his book smarts to rig up some simple machines to make the factory run more efficiently. This infuriates Murdstone, who is nothing if not committed to the evil part of his evil capitalist brand, and won't be having with his workers being anything other than completely miserable.
But now they're more efficient.
Happiness leads to great expectations!
Oh, no shout-outs, please. To punish Davy and Mealy for making his business more profitable, Murdstone puts them on double shifts and forces them to do a stint in the tower, which really isn't as bad as it sounds. There's not much danger of anything other than boredom, and Davy can pass the time with some storytelling and his big pop ballad.
Is there anyone to guide me?
I can't anymore. Mr. Palin, if you would, please.
It's dull. My God, it's dull.
When you take into account all the acid sequence songs, the over-the-top villains, and fucking cheese zombies, this movie has no right being as unbearably tedious as it is. Yet somehow it feels longer than reading the actual book, despite cutting out a significant chunk of its plot and characters. Actually, that might be part of the problem. David Copperfield really is the least interesting person in his own story, and when you remove the colorful supporting cast, it becomes a bit of a slog. And while it does still touch on the novel's deeper themes, the exploitation of children in labor, inequality in marriage, the villains are much more cartoonish in more ways than one, so it doesn't resonate. Working double shifts leaves Davy with only an hour's break to visit the Micawbers, who are currently engaged in another round of creditor dodging.
I told you that Mr. Micawber is at the North Pole, helping with the banana harvest.
Bananas? At the North Pole?
At this time of year, at this time of day, in this part of the country.
The creditors are run off again. Never mind how, their scenes aren't even worth bothering with. And though the Micawbers don't have any food on hand for our young heroes, that doesn't bring down Mr. Micawber as he explains his philosophy.
In song form.
Yeah, I used that joke already, but this movie is killing my creativity. Not even Micawber's song, a bit of batshit where the characters parade around a landscape made of food, can elicit anything more than a bemused, huh. Micawber manages to sneak one of Peggoty's letters to Davy, and he learns that his mom isn't doing well and his letters haven't reached her. He gives Micawber a letter for Peggotty, but Murdstone's threatening to have the baby Micawbers put to work if they don't toe the line, so that goes nowhere, I guess? And hey, Agnes is back in the plot, having snuck out of her ivory tower to see just how bad the workhouse conditions are and have a touching reunion with Davy.
I care, Davy. I care.
Uh-huh?
Your song? Is there anyone?
No, I draw the line at our leads being connected through song magic. That's going straight into glitter territory, and nobody wants that. Murdstone discovers Agnes and sends her back to her father, who is more concerned with his own image than labor rights, which, yeah, I'll believe that. Davy falls back on trying to think of an escape plan, unaware that his mother has died. Oh yeah, Claire is dead now, and Peggotty crying about it for 15 seconds is all the time this movie is willing to spend on that plot development, despite Mealy's repeated insistence that escape is impossible. Seriously, this debate forms about 70% of their conversations. Besides, Davy's not equipped to deal with the seedier side of London, so Mealy enlightens him in sin number 7, Street Smart.
Let him know you got your own way of walking, your own way of talking tough. If you want to make him shake, little brother, you can be a powder puff.
The animals doing Dickens thing is really the big tip-off, but this song is where it becomes painfully obvious how much this movie wants to be Oliver and Company. It's basically Why Should I Worry with the serial numbers rubbed off. But it comes way too late in the film. This should really be Mealy's establishing number. Plunking it down as a lead-in to the third act, especially with the whole Peggotty is coming to London to tell Davy his mom is dead thing hanging in the air, is extraordinarily bad timing. Also, there's a big difference between cute stray animals chasing around New York City and a couple of abused workhouse kids trying to survive the Victorian London slums. It turns out Clara made a new will a couple of days before her death, and since Murdstone is itching to get his hands on it, Peggotty gives it to the Macabres to hide. Davy learns the sad news and decides the sensible thing to do is to storm right into Murdstone's office and accuse him of murder. So Davy and Mealy get thrown into the tower, again, and Davy makes vague plans to escape. Again.
Well, if you're ever going to try and escape, now's the time. They've been fattening her up for weeks. She won't be as fast.
Why fatten a vulture?
Why fatten a turkey?
No, I don't know how Mealy knows this, but it doesn't really matter. The point is the cheese monster overhears the whole thing and is not happy to hear Murdstone's plans for her giblets. While Murdstone and Grimby find Clara's will in under 2 minutes, Davy makes plans to escape the factory in a hollowed-out cheese wheel. This doesn't last very long either, as he leaps to the aid of Agnes when she comes to the factory to find him. With Mealy and the cheese monster offering an assist, Davy and Agnes are able to get the Here out of Dodge in a daring yet somehow dull escape.
Go on, get it back! He's going up on the roof! He's going up on the roof!
Davy!
Agnes! Why don't you jump, boy?
At this point, the movie goes into a jumbled mess of a climax, where it struggles to keep track of all its plot threads despite not having a whole lot of them to deal with. The main arc is concerned with Agnes and Davy's attempts to get to Aunt Betsy. Remember her? Who Davy believes can help him because reasons. Murdstone and Grimby are hot on their tails, and Davy's Robin friend, whose name I've only just now learned actually is Robin, has escaped being shackled in Murdstone's office and is on his way to help. Somehow this all ends with Davy and Agnes being chased by boars and a reprise of their syrupy love ballad. I should really be more entertained by the surreal crazy here, but let's move on. At the same time, Mealy and Macabre have been thrown to the Moldies, and Peggotty and Mrs. Macabre are bonding, which leads me to think they should abandon this whole mess for a Boston marriage. Meanwhile, Robin and Davy rescue Agnes from the boars, only for our heroes to wind up dangling over an inevitable waterfall, which Murdstone and Grimby are only too happy to plunge them into.
We did it! We did it!
Our villains, ladies and gentlemen! Murdstone spreads word that Davy is dead, but of course he and Agnes have managed to survive, somehow, and collapse on Aunt Betsy's doorstep, where they are discovered by her cranky parrot companion, Mr. Polly, which would actually be a good name for a Dickens character. Mr. Polly gets the whole story from Robin and is able to translate it into human, anthropomorphic cat, whatever, for Aunt Betsy.
All hands on deck! Miss Betsy's on the march! Hoist the mainsail! Weigh the anchor! Keel the hole!
Mr. Polly is making a bid to be the most annoying character in this movie, and he's only in it for the last 10 minutes. Aunt Betsy explains she's never hated Davy despite all the evidence, and agrees to help. Back in London, Murdstone has convinced Agnes's dad to sign over ownership of the factory. Don't ask how, he just does. This movie doesn't just have a short attention span, it doesn't know what it should be focusing on to make the movie interesting or coherent. Nevertheless, the Duke is about to sign on the dotted line when...
Oh, I say, what's that ruckus? Oh. Ha-ha! Imprison them all!
Yes, Aunt Betsy has brought those heroes of the disenfranchised, those crusaders against corruption... the local police. Murdstone defends himself with a cheese gun. Whatever. But Davy, Indiana Joneses him and Grimby out the window and into the long arm of the law. The villains are arrested, the factory workers sing about freedom, Mealy and Macabre are half moldied, but that's okay because a little sunlight undoes the whole thing, the factory is turned into an orphanage, and everyone has a Merry Christmas.
There's nothing like a family Christmas.
Christmas is a family time.
I don't know how David Copperfield manages to be so off-the-wall crazy and yet so unbelievably boring. Most of the songs have the potential to be entertaining in their weirdness, but they come in between long stretches of empty business, uninteresting characters, and glacial plot progression. It's all just unsettling and confusing, so the Court of Musical Hell orders those involved to be stuck in a furry convention. Unless, they're into that sort of thing, in which case, I don't know, turn them into moldies or something. This movie couldn't be bothered to come up with anything that made sense, so why should I? So let it be recorded. This session of the Infernal Court in Musical Hell is now adjourned.